So the Chinese government holds about $1 trillion of U.S. debt, but Americans also hold about $1 trillion of Chinese debt. And this money that the U.S. taxpayers lent to China in the early 20th century, but never got paid back for. You recently published an article about that, which went viral. What is this 20th century debt China owes the U.S.?
Well, under successor government doctrine in international law, the sovereign debt of the previous governments of the Chinese emperor, who abdicated in 1911, and then subsequently the Republic of China government, which lasted until 1949 when they lost the Chinese Civil War to the PRC, that government, the Chinese emperor's debt, that rolled over to the ROC government, and then the ROC's debt then should have rolled over to the PRC government under successor government doctrine. And that's accepted in international law, the UN Convention, domestic US law, and as well international finance law, and of course the rules of the IMF. And every country is expected to, be obligated to adhere to that law, those laws. But sadly, China is allowed to have its cake and eat it too. They're constantly allowed to break these laws because we're doing a lot of business with them, and a lot of people don't want to upset the apple cart. But remember, Chris, it's selective default because they have paid British bondholders.
So the same kind of debt China owes the U.S., it also owed to the UK, but paid the UK.
Yes. So what happened is that during the negotiations for the return of Hong Kong, Margaret Thatcher said, Prime Minister of the UK at the time, said, we own Hong Kong Island and Kowloon Peninsula outright under the Treaty of Nanking, and they were virtually uninhabited when the British arrived. But it was the new territories that they leased on a 99-year lease, which expired in 1998. And of course, she said, fine, you can either we can renew the lease or you can have the new territories back. And they said, no, we want the whole colony back, or we'll just turn off the water. And faced with that dilemma, Mrs. Thatcher said, fine, but you have to then pay UK bondholders of this defaulted Chinese sovereign debt. Otherwise, you will not have access to UK capital markets. And that, if you look at, not only is that devastating to China, but Hong Kong was and still is inextricably linked to UK capital markets, and it would have made Hong Kong ruinous. And to give Hong Kong back to China without having access to UK capital markets would have been basically deflating that great prize.
And so to be clear, these bonds are essentially debt created by the Republic of China government, the old government of China, to finance infrastructure, what have you. They defaulted on their debt because of the Japanese invasion. And now you say the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for that debt, for that default.
Well, yes, because they're the successor government. And so, for example, when the Tsar's regime fell to the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War, that debt automatically transferred to the Bolsheviks. Now, at the time, the Bolsheviks wanted nothing to do with Western capital markets because theirs was a pure communist system, or what they tried to build. That, as we know, failed. And then, of course, in the 1980s, during Perestroika, Boris Yeltsin again tried to reform communism and tried to engage with capital markets in the West. And that, of course, that started an attempt to pay the Russian debt off. So eventually, the problem is that other countries, they want to engage in Western capital markets, even if they've defaulted, eventually they're forced to pay up when they want to get back into Western markets. In China's case, the Americans have allowed them uniquely to engage in American capital markets. And that was, of course, Henry Kissinger's decision under Richard Nixon in the 70s to allow them to enter into U.S. capital markets and to open up business. And where the Americans didn't actually negate the debt and say they agreed with China's default, they simply said, this is an issue, we'll kick the tin down the road for a later date to discuss.
So it doesn't matter that these bonds are 80 years old to a different government. The Chinese Communist Party is responsible by a lot of precedent, too.
Well, exactly, by a lot of precedents. For example, it was in 2015, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, the Treasury Minister, paid off the British debt from the 1720s, which, of course, was the South Sea Company debt, where Britain bailed out the South Sea Company. So that debt was paid off from 1720. It was paid off in 2015. So all bonds are old to varying degrees, and many are even older than the Chinese selectively defaulted debt to American bondholders. So the Chinese and their allies are in the habit of saying, "Oh, these are antique bonds, or they're historic." Well, all bonds are antique or historic to some degree.
And so, who owns these bonds?
So these bonds are owned by American citizens. They've been either passed down through generations, or they've been purchased by individuals generationally down the line. And 90% of them are under the American Bondholders Foundation, which has the American Bondholders Foundation has the power of attorney over 90% of these bonds.
And that's in total about $1 trillion worth of debt.
So that's over 20,000 bonds. Mm-hmm. These were gold-denominated bonds, and that is just over 20,000. And they got real stuff with this. The imperial government before 1911, as well as the ROC, took out these gold-denominated bonds, and they purchased roads, bridges. They built massive infrastructure, railway, stuff that they still have, stuff that they use to open up their country and develop it. This is infrastructure they still benefit from. And not only that, they took out a tax to underwrite this debt, to tax their own citizens. And the irony is that the PRC actually repealed the debt in 1949, but they kept the tax that they took out to underwrite the debt up until it was raised, I think, a few years ago at a congressional committee hearing.
Well, so then the obvious question is, why didn't the U.S. do what the U.K. did? Why did he get to make the decision that we'll just give China access to American capital markets and not worry about this debt?
Well, State Department has released the memos and communiques between Kissinger and the State Department about these negotiations. And basically, I think he made a clear decision that this was not an issue they were going to raise in those negotiations. They were adamant that they wanted to open up trade and normalize relations and give most favored nation status to China. And there was a bit of cynicism, and also I think there was, in the sense that people wanted to make money and open up a massive new market, but also there was a lot of naivete. I've spoken throughout the years to a lot of officials at the United Nations and, of course, the U.S. government and elsewhere, on the left and the right. This is a bipartisan issue. And they've had a view that if we embrace China, and this was, I think, the initial view of Kissinger as well, if we embrace China, if we do business with them, if we open up, they'll become more like us. Just like a lot of people feel that, because we engaged Mikhail Gorbachev and all the rest of it, eventually the Soviet Union fell and collapsed. There was a belief that somehow the PRC regime would simply, become democratic and fade away, and they'll become just like us and embrace Western norms of international rights law, etc. That has not happened. And of course, now the situation is getting much worse, and we're effectively in a new Cold War.